The boat rose high above the ground, carried on the shoulders of the men of Kiev like a sacred relic. Inside sat 20 elite ambassadors, smiling with the arrogance of conquerors who believed they had just secured a throne. They did not see the massive pit already waiting in the distance. They did not notice the cold, unblinking eyes of the woman watching from the balcony, her face a mask of porcelain stillness. In this moment, they believed they were the masters of her fate, unaware that the ground beneath them was about to swallow their legacy forever. This is not just a tale of a fallen ruler, but a masterclass in how a single miscalculation can turn a victory into an absolute erasure. This is the story of a woman whom the world expected to break, but who instead decided to rewrite the rules of power with the blood of those who dared to pity her. In the year 945, the Kievan Rus was a land of vast, suffocating forests and precarious alliances held together by tribute and fear. Prince Igor, the ruler of this burgeoning empire, made a fateful decision driven by a hunger that transcended logic. He returned to the lands of the Drevlians to demand a second tribute within the same month, breaking the unspoken laws of patronage. The Drevlians, a fierce and independent people living under the canopy of ancient oaks, saw this as an existential threat. They decided that a leader whose greed could not be satiated was a leader who could no longer be allowed to breathe. They took action, and Igor's journey ended in a scream that echoed through the trees. They bound his limbs to two bent birch trees and let them snap back, tearing his body in two. To the Drevlians, they hadn't just killed a man, they had pruned a branch from a dying dynasty. They looked toward the widow, Olga, and saw only a mourning figure with a young son who was too small to even lift a ceremonial sword. To the Drevlian leader, Prince Mal, the situation was an opportunity for a bloodless expansion. He believed that Olga, stranded in a court of ambitious men and holding a fragile crown, would grasp at any hand offered to her. He sent 20 of his most distinguished men to deliver a proposal of marriage, confident that she would see the logic in their offer. They arrived at her gates not as enemies, but as suitors, carrying the heavy weight of their own ambition. They walked with the stride of men who had already won, failing to notice that the air in Kiev had turned unnaturally still. Their vanity acted as a blindfold, leading them straight to the edge of an abyss they had dug for themselves. Olga received them with a calmness that should have chilled their blood. She did not weep. She did not scream. Instead, she offered them a compliment that fed their pride, whispering that their words were pleasing and that she recognized her husband would never return from the earth. She suggested that to honor their high status, they should return to their boat and wait for the morning. She promised them that her people would carry them into the city within their vessel, treating them like the nobility they believed themselves to be. The ambassadors agreed, retreating to their ship with dreams of wealth and influence, never realizing they were being treated as cargo rather than guests. While they toasted to their perceived victory, the sound of shovels striking earth echoed through the night. A deep, wide trench was dug in the courtyard of the castle, a wound in the ground waiting to be filled. The next morning, the men of Kiev lifted the Drevlian boat onto their shoulders. The ambassadors sat proudly within, looking down at the commoners below, feeling like gods being carried to a wedding. They wore their finest silks and held their heads high, their smiles wide and predatory. But as they reached the center of the courtyard, the rhythmic motion of the march stopped. The boat tilted. Before the messengers could comprehend the shift in their fortune, they were tumbled into the dark, damp earth of the pit. Olga stood at the edge, her silhouette sharp against the morning sky. She looked down at the men struggling in the dirt, their silk stained, their pride evaporating into raw terror. She asked them, with a voice as cold as a winter stream, if they found the honor to their liking. Their realization came far too late. The earth was shoveled back into the hole, and the screams of the first wave of messengers were silenced by the suffocating weight of the soil. This was only the beginning of a calculated response that defied every convention of the time. Olga knew that if she stopped there, the Drevlian army would descend upon Kiev in a rage. She needed to ensure that their leadership was dismantled before they even realized a war had begun. She sent word back to Prince Mal, claiming that she was honored by his proposal but required his most distinguished governors and merchants to escort her to his land. She insisted that her people would only accept the union if she were brought to him with the highest level of dignity, accompanied by the very men who held the Drevlian state together. Mal, blinded by the prospect of ruling the Rus, complied immediately. He sent the core of his administration, the men who managed his lands, commanded his forces, and held the keys to his power. He sent his brains and his blades, thinking he was sending an escort. He was actually sending a sacrifice. When these high-ranking officials arrived in Kiev, Olga offered them the hospitality of a bathhouse to cleanse themselves after their long journey. In the culture of the time, this was a gesture of supreme respect, an invitation to lower one's guard. The Drevlian nobles, weary from travel, entered the wooden structure, leaving their guards and their weapons outside. The air inside was thick with steam and the scent of cedar. Once they were settled within, the atmosphere changed. The sound of a heavy wooden bar sliding across the outer door cut through the hiss of the water. The heat they expected soon became something far more intense as the building was surrounded by dry brush and timber. Flames licked at the walls, and the steam turned to suffocating smoke. There were no negotiations and no second chances. The men who were supposed to lead the Drevlian state were removed from the equation in a single afternoon, their final cries lost in the roar of the fire. Olga watched the smoke rise, her eyes reflecting the orange glow of the embers, already planning her next move. With the Drevlian leadership effectively decapitated, Olga did not wait for the news to reach their capital of Iskarostan. She began a march toward their territory, but not with the appearance of an invading army. She sent word ahead that she was coming to perform the traditional funeral rites at the site where her husband had fallen. She requested that the Drevlians prepare a great feast, a trizna, to honor the memory of Igor. The Drevlians, unaware of the fate of their two previous delegations, believed that she was finally submitting to the inevitable. They prepared a massive celebration, bringing out their best food and their strongest drink. They saw the widow coming to mourn, and they felt a sense of victory over the House of Kiev. They did not see the 5,000 soldiers trailing quietly in her wake, hidden by the shadows of the forest. Olga arrived with a small, elite group of followers, her head bowed in a performance of grief that was as flawless as it was deadly. She sat among the Drevlians, her voice soft, her manner humble. She encouraged them to celebrate, to drink to the memory of the fallen prince, and ensured their cups were never empty. She watched as the men who had murdered her husband grew clumsy and loud, their speech slurred by the potent honey mead. The night air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and the false sense of security that comes with intoxication. As the Drevlians fell into a deep, heavy slumber, the atmosphere shifted. The mourning widow transformed back into the strategist. She gave a sharp, silent signal to her men. The feast ended not with a toast, but with a cold, systematic efficiency. Swords were drawn in the moonlight, the steel gleaming with a pale, ghostly light. By the time the sun rose over the forest, the power of the Drevlian elite had been entirely neutralized. 5,000 men who had expected a wedding found themselves at a massacre, their blood soaking the ground where Igor had been torn apart. Yet, the city of Iskarostan still stood, its high wooden walls providing a final refuge. The common people and the remaining soldiers retreated behind these fortifications, finally realizing that the woman they had underestimated was the greatest threat they had ever faced. Olga laid siege to the city, but she did not use traditional methods. For a full year, the two sides remained at a stalemate. The Drevlians were terrified, knowing that every attempt at diplomacy had ended in blood. They waited for the inevitable assault, for the ladders and the battering rams, but Olga remained patient. She watched the walls from her camp, knowing that hunger and fear were more effective than any sword. She was not just waiting for them to weaken, she was waiting for the perfect moment to erase them from history. Eventually, Olga sent a message to the starving citizens of Iskorostan. Her voice, carried by messengers, sounded weary and uncharacteristically merciful. She told them that she had already taken her vengeance and that she no longer wished to see them suffer. She pointed out that their leaders were gone and their fields were neglected. She offered a strange and seemingly humble peace. She asked for no gold, no silver, and no slaves. Instead, she requested a tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every household. To the exhausted defenders, this seemed like the whim of a woman who was tired of war, perhaps a symbolic gesture of submission to end the cycle of violence. They caught the birds from their eaves and sent them to her camp in cages, believing they had bought their survival with a few handfuls of feathers. They closed their gates that night feeling a profound sense of relief, unaware that they had just handed her the instruments of their destruction. The genius of her plan was revealed at dusk. Olga instructed her followers to tie small pieces of cloth infused with sulfur and thread to the legs of each bird. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cloths were ignited, and the birds were released. Instinct, stronger than any training, drove the birds back to their nests within the city. They flew into the thatched roofs, the wooden granaries, and the dry haylofts of Iskorostan. Within minutes, the city was not facing an external attack, but an internal inferno that could not be contained. Every house caught fire simultaneously, making it impossible for the inhabitants to extinguish the flames. The sky turned a bruised purple, choked with the soot of a dying city. As the people fled the burning ruins, they were met by Olga's forces waiting outside the gates. There was no mercy left to give. The city was leveled, its people scattered or enslaved, and its name became a footnote in the records of the Rus. The fall of Iskorostan marked the end of the Drevlians as a sovereign power. Their lands were integrated into the Kievan Rus, and the tribute they once fought against was replaced by a system of laws and administrative districts established by Olga herself. She did not just win a war, she restructured an entire society. She moved the state away from a system of personal whims and sporadic raids, creating a structured government with defined taxes and trade routes. She became the first ruler of the Rus to create a central authority that could survive the death of a leader. She proved that power was not just about the strength of an arm, but the depth of a plan. In the years that followed, Olga's legacy took an even more unexpected turn. She traveled to Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, where she engaged in high-level diplomacy with the emperor. She was baptized, becoming one of the first high-ranking rulers of the Rus to embrace Christianity. This was a masterstroke of geopolitics, aligning her realm with the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean. She was later canonized as a saint, recognized for her role in bringing a new faith to her people. The woman who had buried men alive and burned a city to the ground was now being hailed as equal to the apostles. The irony of her history is profound. Her story challenges the traditional narrative of the era, proving that intelligence and patience are often more formidable than brute force. She navigated a world that gave her no room for error, surrounded by enemies who saw her only as a prize to be won. By refusing to play by their rules, she ensured that her son would inherit an empire that was stronger, more organized, and more unified than the one her husband had left behind. She did not just seek revenge, she sought stability. Every act of violence was a brick in the foundation of a nation. Olga of Kiev remains a figure of intense fascination because she embodies the duality of power. She was a protector and a destroyer, a diplomat and a tactician, a saint and a shadow. Her actions were not driven by simple cruelty, but by a cold necessity to protect her dynasty in a landscape where weakness was a death sentence. She taught the world that the most dangerous opponent is not the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who listens, waits, and understands the weight of a single bird. She showed that the fire of a woman's grief can be harnessed to forge a crown that lasts a millennium. As we look back at the smoking ruins of Iskorostan and the silent halls of the Kievan Palace, we see a blueprint for survival. The Drevlians thought they were dealing with a widow, they were actually dealing with an architect of history. Her revenge was the foundation of a state. It serves as a stark reminder that in the game of power, those who underestimate their opposition based on appearance are often the first to be erased. The fires she lit that night did more than burn a city, they forged a legacy that would endure, proving that while history is written by the victors, it is shaped by those who have the courage to be truly calculated. In the end, the earth didn't just swallow her enemies, it became the stage for her ascent.